Good morning, everybody. Pastor Steve here. Thank you for joining me for today's devotion. We are in 2 Kings chapter 17. So as you open your Bible there, I want to remind you, if you have not yet picked up your copy of the new Bible reading plan for 2025, do so this Sunday morning at church. You'll see the D group banner, and the reading plans will be on the table in front of that. I also want to remind you that this Sunday evening at 5 o'clock, our children's choirs will be doing their Christmas program. So that's 5 o'clock this Sunday evening. And of course, on Sunday morning, all three worship services in our normal Sunday school classes, or life groups as we call them here at First Baptist. So 2 Kings 17, in this chapter, we jump ahead about maybe a little more than 200 years in the history of the northern kingdom of Israel, also known as Samaria. Remember, after Solomon's death, the nation became two nations: the northern nation, the northern kingdom, Samaria, Israel. First king was Jeroboam. The southern kingdom, with its capital in Jerusalem, is called Judea from that point forward, and its first king was Rehoboam. So we jump ahead a little over 200 years to the end of the northern kingdom of Israel, or Samaria, that happened in 722 BC when the Assyrian army, the Assyrian Empire, conquered and destroyed the northern kingdom and deported or exiled the residents to different parts of the Middle East to live. And so we read about that in the first 6 verses, starting in chapter 17, verse 1. In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah. So Ahaz is the king in the south. Hoshea, he's the king in the north. Hoshea, the son of Eli, became king over Israel in Samaria. Samaria was now the capital city, as well as sometimes the name of the nation. And he reigned 9 years. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, only none as the kings of Israel who were before him. In other words, he was not as bad. He still did evil, but not as bad as Jeroboam and those who followed Jeroboam. But he was still an evil king. Shalmaneser, the king of Assyria, and in history that would be Shalmaneser the fifth. Shalmaneser the fifth, king of Assyria, came up against him, and Hoshea became his servant and paid him tribute. In other words, to keep the nation from being destroyed, Hoshea and Israel surrendered to Assyria and started paying taxes or tribute to that conquering nation, if you will. In verse 4, the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hoshea, and he sent messengers because the Hoshea sent messengers to So, the king of Egypt, and offered and stopped paying the tribute to the king of Assyria. And so that made the king of Assyria angry. And so at the end of verse 4, so the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. He put Hoshea, the king of Israel, in prison. And then the king of Assyria invaded the whole land, went up to Samaria, and besieged it 3 years. And in the verse 6, in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. So the northern nation loses the war. The city, the nation are captured. And he says, carried Israel away into exile to Assyria. So carried the citizens of the northern kingdom of Israel, of Samaria, as captives away from their homeland and settled them in Halah and Habor on the river of Goshen and in the cities of the Medes. So transported them to the east, to Mesopotamia, areas in, say, northern Iraq and other places. And the northern kingdom of Israel ceased to exist. The Jewish people of the north continued to live, but they lived in other places. They didn't live in the promised land. And there was never a return of those tribes to reestablish the northern kingdom. And so this is the disappearance of the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, starting in verse 7, he explains why this happened to the northern kingdom. He says in verse 7, now this came about because the sons of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God. So the people of the nation were sinning. Sinned against God who brought them up from Egypt, going all the way back to the beginning of their nation because they had feared other gods. And verse 8, walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord had driven out. In other words, when they conquered the promised land during the days of Joshua, they conquered the land, and the people who had been living there were forced out. What did the Jewish people do when they settled the land? They started following the customs and traditions and the idol worship of the very people they had conquered. Crazy, but that's what they did. And verse 9, the sons of Israel did things secretly, which were not right against the Lord. They built high places, which is a place for them to worship pagan gods. Verse 10, they set up for themselves sacred pillars and the Asherim, places to worship these different religions, if you will. These religions, some of them that had a perverse sexual nature to them. Verse 11, burning incense in the high places. In other words, as a way of worshiping idols. And at the end of verse 11, they provoked the Lord by doing that. In verse 12, they served idols. They served idols. And then in verses 13 and 14, God had warned them over and over. And remember, we're reading these chapters, for about 3 weeks, these chapters kind of jumping around a little bit. But now, remember, you go all the way back to the time of Moses, okay? The time of Moses, which would have been more than 400 years before this chapter we're reading today. All the way back to the time of Moses, God had warned them if they would be true and faithful to Him, He would bless them. But if they turned away from Him and worshiped idols and other religions and gods and all that, they would be cursed, and He would judge them, and they would pay for it. And He tells us He sent prophets and seers. He warned them for 400 years, time and time again. Now, listen, nobody can say God is not patient. Nobody can say God is not patient. He gave them 400 years of warning before the northern kingdom was destroyed, going all the way back to the time of Moses. He gave them 200 years of warning going back to their first king, Jeroboam, before he destroyed the nations. That's a long time, but they rejected God. They worshiped Baal. They made the golden images, the two calves, and in verse 18, the Lord was very angry with Israel, the northern kingdom, and He removed them from His sight. And when it says none was left except the tribe of Judah, that's Judah and the little bitty tribe of Benjamin, referring to the southern kingdom of Judah, whose capital was Jerusalem, and at this point in time had the king named Ahaz, a descendant of David and Solomon. So, wow. Are you seeing the pattern? Are you seeing the history as to why these things happened? Now, he tells us in verse 19 that the southern kingdom really wasn't much better. They were also sinful and didn't obey God. Starting in verses 24 to the end of the chapter, he describes how when they exiled the Jews in the north, took them over to northern Mesopotamia and Assyria and settled them in different places, when they moved those people out, the Assyrians had a policy of displacing people. And so when they displaced the Jews from their homeland, they took other people they had conquered and displaced them from their homelands and resettled them in Samaria, in Israel, in the territory of the northern kingdom. Now, you still had some of the poor Jews living there, and now you have these Gentiles who are moved into that area that was the land of the 10 northern tribes, the northern kingdom. Over time, these intermarried, and they mixed the religion of the Jews, the religion that Jeroboam created in the south, in the north rather. They mixed the pagan religions they brought with them from other places, and they had this syncretistic approach. And he tells us here that they feared God, but they worshiped idols. In other words, they had their feet in all these different places. It's like a lot of people in our culture today. Yeah, I'm a Christian, but their lives don't show it. Yeah, I'm a Christian, but they believe what Buddhists say. I'm a Christian, I believe in Jesus, but they believe in, they mix all these different religious thoughts and philosophies. And that's what these people did. And God rejected it. And he rejects it when people are syncretistic and mixed religions today. And by the way, this resettling of the peoples in the end of this chapter is the beginning of the people that we meet in the New Testament, known as the Samaritans. This is where it all gets started, is in this chapter. Now, to wrap it up, one quick devotional thought. Verses 21 to 23. When he had torn Israel, when God had torn Israel, the northern kingdom, the northern 10 tribes, from the house of David, they made Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, king. So going back 200 years before Hoshea in this chapter, just going back to the beginning of the northern kingdom, God tore those tribes away from the descendants of David, and it created another nation 200 years earlier. Jeroboam, their first king. It says in verse 21, then Jeroboam drove Israel, the northern kingdom, away from following the Lord and made them commit a great sin. We talked about that a few days ago, that Jeroboam wanted to keep power, and he was afraid if they kept going down to Jerusalem to worship at the temple and make sacrifices at the temple and to celebrate these national holidays in Jerusalem, that in time the people's hearts would be drawn back to Jerusalem and they would want to reunite the country. So he created his own competing religion in the north. That's the great sin he's talking about. Then verse 22, the sons of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam. So the people went along and liked it. They did not depart from them. So as generations were born, they continued in that sin until, verse 23, the Lord removed Israel from his sight. And Israel was carried away into exile from their own land to Assyria to this day. And my devotional thought from that is this: the power, the influence of leaders on a people for good or for bad, for holiness or for evil. And the power, the influence of a leader on a people, not just for the moment, but potentially for years after that leader is dead, beyond their lifetime. See, we need godly leaders in the home, godly leaders on our school board, godly leaders in district leadership and as principals in our local schools, godly leaders in law enforcement, in the courts and judicial system, godly leaders in the governor's office, godly leaders in the halls of Congress, godly leaders in the White House. We need godly leaders because their influence is powerful and it can last for generations. And when I say godly leaders, I'm not talking about leaders who simply use the right words. I'm talking about men and women who love God with all their heart, soul, and mind and strength, and whose lives are godly in all aspects. We desperately need to pray for God to raise up godly leaders at every level of life. That's the lesson of Jeroboam and the northern kingdom of Israel. Not one godly king in the northern kingdom, from its inception under Jeroboam until its demise under Hoshea. Not one godly king. Some worse than others, but not a single godly king. I look forward to being able to vote at every level of life for people who really are good and not just the lesser of two evils. May that day come if we want America to survive. God bless you. I'll see you tomorrow as we look at, what are we looking at tomorrow? 2 Chronicles 36. God bless you and Merry Christmas, everybody.